Good morning, everyone. My name is Nathan Felton. I work at the Rochester Institute of Technology. I am primarily in charge of computer labs within the College of Science. Ironically enough, as involved as I am with the Mac community, I am technically only responsible for about 47 Macs, but I enjoy playing around a lot, so I am pretty active in the community, and I'll get into that towards the end of this presentation if you guys ever need to ask any questions. Real quick, I do have a shameless plug. This is my 8-month-old daughter. Thank you. So Kaylin, if you're ever watching this on YouTube, if it's around in 16 years, Daddy loves you. All right, so this morning the whole point of this is hopefully within 60 minutes, we will have a working DeployStudio environment. Now I will kind of proceed that with, we will not actually be using DeployStudio, only setting it up. So hopefully some of you or all of you are willing to stay for the advanced session afterwards, which actually gets into the use of the workflows and some of the advanced features of DeployStudio. So without further ado, hopefully Prezi cooperates with me. The first thing you guys don't need to do here, but will do at home, is download DeployStudio. There are two links available. There's the top link, which is the most recent version, which is actually also available on the home page. But at the news link, you can actually get the release notes for the current version that's out, as well as there's an archive for previous versions. Something I will note right out of the box is the most recent version that we're using today is 1.6.0, and it does not support Leopard anymore. So you can only use Snow Leopard or beyond at this point. But the archives do have older versions that will allow you to use, there's an older version that allows you to use Leopard, and there's even an older version that will allow you to use Tiger if you're still on that. So those are some links to note down. And again, they're just at deploystudio.com, and there's links at the top of the page. So we're going to move on to the installation. For anyone here that has a lab machine that's provided, if you open up your downloads folder, there should be a DMG. Or Dimage, depending on your vocabulary. If you want to go ahead and mount that, that will give you the DeployStudio installer. It should be an MPKG, little package-looking box. Everyone got it so far? Okay. So go ahead and just like every other installer that us sysadmins go through, just continue, agree, continue, install, finish, whatever those steps are. I'm going to kind of follow along here and try and do it at the same time. So you can mount your Dimage. Run your installer. Continue, agree, install. For those that aren't already aware, it's Mac user for the lab machines. All right. Oops. Is everyone at that part where it's installed? Anyone wait? No? Oh. Yes? Okay. Come on, Prezi. There we go. So OS configuration. So DeployStudio mostly there's a couple different configurations, but the way we're going to do it today is through an AFP share. And an AFP share, you need to have access through an account. The way I prefer to do it is to create a local user account that has access to that share. So if you would all open up your system preferences and go to add a user. So system preferences, users and groups, unlock. This would be great for that authorization session only. The one thing I will note about this, if you guys wish, is you can make this a sharing only account. That kind of limits what it has access to. Just give it any password you like. Just remember it. Great user. All right. So you now have a sharing only DeployStudio user account. Oh, Prezi's going to be a pain. There we go. So the next step is good. Anything you like. Just remember it. The next step is to actually create the folder you're going to share, and this folder is going to become your DeployStudio repository. So I have my Macintosh HD on the desktop, but if you guys don't, you can go to Go Computer and get to your Macintosh HD. I choose to put it in the root of my root folder, or root drive. So all you got to do is create a new folder. I call mine DeployStudio with camel caps. I just learned about snake case this week in Python. They prefer snake case. Anyways, at that point, if you guys want, you can go to File, Get Info, or Command-I. And there's a couple things I want to point out in here. The first one is down here in Sharing and Permissions, you need to add the DeployStudio account you just created. Ba-dam. And give it read and write permissions. Any questions so far? I want to make sure I got everyone. Say what again? Everything? Okay. Does everyone at least have the folder created? What's that? Oh, but you have the folder. Okay. So as long as you guys have the folder, you can get info on it. Get info is available through the Finder File menu. Get info. Or Command-I if you want to use the keyboard. That should get you this window. And then the first thing you need to do is come down to the bottom where it says Sharing and Permissions. You need to expand that. Press the little plus sign at the bottom and say, well, I can remove it and do it again. There we go, plus sign. Just select the DeployStudio account and click Select. That should put it down here, and then you can give it the privilege of read and write. Got everyone now? Okay, I'm going to keep going. The next thing I'd like to point out is you can optionally label the folder with a color. I choose to do this just to make it kind of pop out. Optionally, the other thing is some people are aware of this, but you can actually change folder icons. I like to actually change mine to be the DeployStudio logo just because I'm kind of goofy like that and enjoy fancy looking things. But to do that, usually you just copy and paste. You can highlight the icon up here in the top left and paste it onto it. Anyways, the next thing you're going to want to do is there's the shared folder checkbox right here in Get Info. When you check that, you should get a little pop-up that says you have to enable file sharing. Do you want to do this? And you can say yes, just enable. And the little checkbox should be checked. And now you officially have an AFP share for your DeployStudio repository. Got everyone so far? Yeah? Okay, good. Back to Prezi. Hopefully. Maybe. Okay. Oh, I just went over all that. All right. There you go. You have installed DeployStudio. Now, DeployStudio is installed, but it's not configured, and in fact, the service isn't even running. So that's kind of the next step. We're going to be using a utility or an application that was installed called DeployStudio Assistant to configure DeployStudio. So in order to get to that, you guys are going to open up Applications, Utilities, and right here is DeployStudio Assistant, which, kind of a side note, it's an alias inside of DeployStudio Admin. They kind of nest the applications together, but they make it nice and easy by giving you an alias. So if you open that up, the first thing you should see is a warning that says, warning, your service is not running. They make it nice and easy, and you can just say, start the service. A little pinwheel, and it should take about, there you go, get a confirmation. And we're going to pick this first option, hopefully, oh, there we go. Obviously I didn't sacrifice anything to the demo gods today. There we go. So first option, oh, this is fun. It's crashing for everyone? Oh. Woohoo, okay, this ought to be fun. This is off to a great start. Let's try reinstalling real quick and see if that fixes it. If not, we got to reboot 3 times. Anyone else having problems, try reinstalling as well. Oh, jeez. What's that? Oh, that's the one. I'm going to show details. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah, anyways. All right. Well, I'm going to reboot my machine. In the meantime, does anyone have any questions? No questions yet? No? What's that? I don't know what you're talking about. Oh. Oh, see, now you're getting ahead of everyone. Yeah, go ahead. Actually.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm seeing this option on here that we're probably not going to be exploring about a DeployStudio PC. And having never seen this before, what the heck is that?
That is actually an option I haven't explored yet, but I do know that there is options to image PCs using DeployStudio. I believe it's done through a Pixie server, but I've never configured it. So has anyone here ever played with DeployStudio for PC? No? Okay. All right, well this looks like it's back up. What am I doing? Okay. Let me get my presentation back up real quick here. Hopefully. Event. Okay. Is anyone else broken? Everyone's good. You're broken? You sure? Okay. Yeah, try rebooting and maybe you can catch up. Okay. Okay. Oh. Could you help him real quick? Thank you. Everyone, Rusty Myers? All right, so let's make sure we're all on the same page. Everyone get to continue after setting up DeployStudio, or actually let me quote exactly what it says. Set up a DeployStudio server. And you should all see, if you hit this drop down, you should see just about everyone's computer in the room. I recommend, at least for this session, because we have so many running at the same time, look at your network settings and figure out what your wired Ethernet port is, which mine is currently manually set, but you guys all should have a DHCP. Those of you using your own laptops, same thing. You can use, except you can use the Wi-Fi port. Effectively, if you even want to, you can cheat and just do localhost, which will actually probably be easier now that I think about it. So you can do localhost. So HTTP localhost :680. That'll make it easy for everyone. And then your username and password is going to be the DeployStudio account you just created. So DeployStudio and whatever your password was. Except I typed my password wrong. There we go. Next step is, whoa, whoa, whoa. 680. Yeah, I'm sorry. Correct. 60,080. How about that? 60,080. Username and password is the DeployStudio account you just created. So whatever your password was. You forgot your password? File a ticket with the help desk. I'll get back to you in 2 to 3 business days. Yes. 60,080. My apologies. All right, we all set on this? Okay. Continue. Master and Replica. For today, we are only going to talk about the master. but just kind of a point of view or a point of fact, I guess, is there is an option to replicate your DeployStudio server to help load balance or use multi-site. Quick fact, I guess, is all it really does is uses rsync in the background to rsync that DeployStudio folder you just created. So it's kind of really simple on the underlyings, I guess you could say. So for now, just click a master and hit continue. And this is where a lot of people will mix up their DeployStudio installation. You get an option for a local folder or a network SharePoint. We are going to be using a network SharePoint, so I'll get that out of the way right now. But a local folder will allow you to set up DeployStudio on an external hard drive or a flash drive or a Thunderbolt drive, your choice, and allows you to effectively plug it into a computer, boot up DeployStudio kind of locally, and then pull down the image all from the external hard drive. No network traffic required. But what a lot of people think is I'm installing DeployStudio on this local machine, and they instantly think local folder, and that's not what you want. And I believe if you read the description, it kind of goes into that. I don't actually read stuff usually, I just kind of click next. Yes, exactly. So we are doing a network SharePoint. The network SharePoint is going to be the AFP share that you just created and set up. So network SharePoint and continue. And this is where we tell it what that network SharePoint is. So this is something that always goofs me up, but if you just press the letter A, it will automatically fill in AFP. Sometimes I'll start typing AFP and I'll end up with something like that. So just A will give you AFP. It is highly recommended that you do a fully qualified domain name for this. So unfortunately, you don't really want localhost here. When you're setting up your actual servers in this room, you can do it, because we're not going to be connecting to each other's today. But normally you want this to be a fully qualified domain name. Or if you're in a network environment that everything is static IPs, I'm sorry, but you can do it that way. So I'm just going to do localhost. I think you can do that, but we'll find out. And then for authentication, you're going to again use DeployStudio and the password that you set for that account. Yes, so you cannot use localhost. That was my bad. So you do need an IP address at this step. So again, if you guys need to, go up to network. You can go up to the little Wi-Fi thing and open network preferences and get your local adapter's IP address. Of course, I just said that. Now I don't remember what mine was. There you go. All right. Sorry for that confusing step. Is everyone on the same page? You need your IP address? Good? All right. Now you should be able to hit continue. Does everyone have email notifications? Okay. Does anyone need help? Raise of hands. Yes? Rusty can help you here. Are people just playing catch up? Okay. Yeah, that should have been covered when you got info on the DeployStudio folder you created. You should have enabled share. It should pop up with a thing to say enable service. And we'll just do it this way. So yes, I'm sorry. For the AFP share, it is case sensitive. So if you do camel caps DeployStudio, you've got to do camel caps DeployStudio in the actual setup step. So in here, it needs to be case sensitive. Back to the DeployStudio folder thing. If you get info, this checkbox should be checked that says shared folder. And when you check that, it should have given you a prompt that says to enable file sharing. So if you didn't get that prompt, you can open up System Preferences, Sharing, and manually turn on the file sharing option. But you should then see DeployStudio down here, hopefully. Good so far? Okay, thank you. All right. I'm going to keep trucking along, so if you guys get to a point where you need help, raise your hand and I or Rusty will try and get to you. But for now, email notifications are great. Oh. Rusty, we can help you. Thanks again, Rusty. So email notifications are great for, depending on your workflow. For me, I only check the failures only option. I'm going to enable this just to show you a little more bold. The failures only is awesome, especially if you have a lot of technicians out in the field helping you out with your DeployStudio, or if you simply want a place to aggregate your logs outside of the DeployStudio interface itself. You got to make sure you check the include log file in body, and it'll also attach the log file. So this is especially great for me because I have co-ops that work for me, and if a workflow ever fails, I get to know right away that something failed, and I can take a look at it, and they can call me on the phone and complain. But it helps kind of get to the resolution faster. If you enable successes and failures, I highly recommend an email filter that you kind of dump them into a folder, because they get kind of, especially for me, I do 35 computers at once in a lab. So if you get 35 successes or failures at once, it kind of inundates your inbox. So you can go through and set all that up. That's pretty standard stuff. For today, we're not going to use it because I don't have an SMTP folder or server set up. Yes? Yes. So the question was, can we go in and reconfigure this later effectively? And the answer to that is yes. You can run this DeployStudio Assistant at any time, and after the first configuration, it actually remembers your previous configuration, so you don't really have to reconfigure everything from scratch. But yes, you can run the Assistant again, click through, continue to this step, and configure it as you want. The same goes for any other step through here. You can go through and rewrite or rerun the configuration at any point during your installation of DeployStudio. So SSL, the recommendation here, so what actually happens is when you run the installer, one of the post-flight scripts it runs is it generates its own self-signed cert called com.deploystudio.server. So effectively, there's no reason not to secure your communication to your DeployStudio server. If you do it when you boot to your Netboot set, and you try to log into your runtime, it's all done over HTTP for the most part, for at least that portion of it. So it's nice to secure that because otherwise you're sending clear text passwords over the network type deal. And I know at RIT we have some, I won't say malicious users, but we definitely have kids that enjoy playing around on the network. So you can also have a certificate generated from your own root CA from your company or organization or school or whatever. But by default, it always gives you com.deploystudio.server. So we're going to select that, and you'll notice in the port box, if you actually go back real quick, I'll do it so you don't have to, but in no SSL, you'll notice the port is 60,080. And by changing it to use com.deploystudio, it changes to 60,443. Yes? You import the cert into your keychain, into the system keychain, if I recall. And then once it's in the system keychain, that's where DeployStudio finds the certs. So when DeployStudio generated its own cert, it just automatically imported it into the system keychain. So if you open up keychain, you'll actually see this cert sitting in there. So if you make your own cert from your own certificate authority, you'll have to import it to your system CA or your system keychain, and it'll show up in this dropdown. Because we're on laptops in here, go ahead and, for the interface, select your Ethernet port, not your Wi-Fi port. For me, it's my Thunderbolt Ethernet. This is actually a bug, I believe, that just came out with 1.6.0. It puts a little comma in for the port number, and I don't know if it breaks it, but I'm not going to take that chance, so just delete the comma. But this is an important step to note, that your initial configuration of DeployStudio after install, you're going to start out on 60,080 for a port, but as soon as you go to this next step or hit continue here, it's going to change the port you connect to the service to start using HTTPS, using SSL. So you got to remember to change your port the next time you try and connect into admin or assistant. Just getting that out there. Another key point to point out is this reject unknown computers. DeployStudio has a database of computers, and there are a new number of ways to use DeployStudio, but effectively, if you check this box, if the computer is not already in that computer database, and you try and run the runtime either from a netboot or from the desktop, you'll be denied the authentication into your environment. So again, this is where you can reconfigure DeployStudio later comes in. By default, I typically leave this unchecked, and I'll boot an entire computer lab, make it check in to the computer database, and all the computers will be in there, and then I'll run this configuration again and check that box so that no other computers can connect to the database after my lab is connected. And this is important because if you don't set up access groups or any kind of advanced authorization other than your simple DeployStudio account, this will prevent computers from running workflows that might have licensed software. It will prevent end users from re-imaging their machine without taking a backup. We've had that happen. So reject unknown computers will help in a way secure your DeployStudio from unauthorized access. Continue. Any questions on that so far? Good. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, I missed it. Okay. Yes, and I will briefly touch on that, but yes, the question is can you add computers manually later on? And yes, through DeployStudio admin, there's just a little plus box, and it's done through either, which we'll see in a minute, it's done either through MAC address or serial number is the identifying piece of information you need. So DeployStudio groups. I'm not going to touch on this too much for this session. I'm going to actually go into this more advanced in my next session. But effectively what you need to know is there's the option to restrict users based on groups with which applications in DeployStudio they have access to. So for the first one you'll see is Assistant Setup, which is what we're currently running, which as you know is how you configure your DeployStudio. So by restricting this to a group, only certain people can actually run the assistant to configure DeployStudio. So at the beginning, when you first typed in an address and you type in your username and password, that it's checking to see if you're a member of, if there was a group here, if you're a member of that group. If you're not, then you don't even get past the first screen and you can't configure DeployStudio. DSAdmin, the primary location to configure and set up workflows is DeployStudio admin. Same thing applies there. If you're not in the group, if there is a group, then you don't get to launch and authenticate to DeployStudio admin, thus preventing people from modifying workflows or adding workflows or scripts or anything like that that's available in admin. DeployStudio runtime is more or less the client of DeployStudio, and that's how you actually run the workflows. This one actually allows for multiple groups, and again, that's in my advanced session on how that'll work. But it allows you to actually restrict who can run the runtime and which workflows they see in the runtime. So hopefully if you're sticking around for the advanced session, you'll kind of get to see how that works. Otherwise, it's available on YouTube. Multicast, last year I didn't know how this worked, but I actually played with this at my school, at my lab, and it actually works quite well. One big note I will note here, do not take either one of these sliders to max. Because DeployStudio will say, well, partition the drive, and then multicast will fail, and you won't have an image on the freshly partitioned drive. So I want to say a shout out to Jason Lang and Chris Scheck, because they managed to attempt this on my 35 Macs in one of my labs, and then had to go from Mac to Mac with a DeployStudio boot drive one by one to fix them. So. And ironically enough, they did that while I was at this conference last year, and I got a nice little picture message on my phone that showed my entire Mac with white screens, or my entire Mac lab with white screens. So, yes. So for today in this session, we're not going to play with this, but I will give that warning. If you do play with multicast in your own deployment, do not try to max out the data rate, even if you have 10 gig fiber or copper. Sorry. Continue. This is a piece of information I was talking about earlier, where you can identify a computer in the database based on its serial number or MAC address. Historically, DeployStudio used its MAC address as the unique identifier, but then they started coming out with USB and Thunderbolt Ethernet adapters for the airs predominantly, and they needed to start identifying them by something else. So the default now is hardware serial number, and I recommend that if you do not already have a DeployStudio server set up, to use that. They only left that in there as a legacy thing for people who are, have a 5-year-old DeployStudio setup. So we're going to do hardware serial number and hit continue. And you should be done. Congratulations, you have set up your very first, or maybe very first, DeployStudio server. Hopefully it actually configured, because I didn't hit finish. Well, hopefully. It should go back to the beginning. So you should all be back at this screen right here if it doesn't quit. So. Sure. It is not. So the question was, is this level of crashing normal? And it is not. This version is only a couple weeks old, I want to say, maybe a month at most. So I've been using it in my production environment stably. This is the most I've ever seen DeployStudio crash ever. And it just crashed again. What's that? It didn't keep any of the settings? Oh, it never keeps that. So that part shouldn't stay there. After you initially log into the server, that's when the settings should be there. So I'm actually going to check mine real quick.
You know it saves, but then it
So this is actually kind of a good point to note out, or whatever. Because you set up SSL, this is where you need to start using 60,443 instead of 60,080. Now that SSL is turned on, you need to start using the new port. Yes, what did I say? Oh, yes, thank you. You also need yes. Demo gods. All right. Yeah, I know. I'm going to try just restarting my service. So this is actually another thing I wanted to point out. I forgot to add to my slides, but when you install DeployStudio, it actually adds a preference pane to system preferences. So you'll notice down here in the lower left corner of System Preferences, DeployStudio Server. It's a really simple interface. It allows you to see the information about your server, and you can restart it using on and off. Which, for me, unfortunately, you'll notice it says repository is not configured, which means that when mine crashed at the end, it probably didn't save any of the settings. Yes? Okay. Okay. Oh, okay. All right, thank you. All right, I tell you what, let's try and get everyone on the same page. So what I want everyone to do right now is open up System Preferences and open up the DeployStudio preference pane. And that way we can all know if you've actually been configured or not. If you have not been configured and yours crashed, you should have an interface similar to mine, unfortunately, that shows repository not configured. So quick show of hands, who has not configured repository? Up high. Okay. You're not doing that good. Okay. Just Rusty went to reboot the switch in the closet. He thinks it might be a network issue. So we'll see if that helps. That's true too. If you want to try using just the Wi-Fi in the room, we're not necessarily doing any communication to each other, so you should be able to use the Wi-Fi port. You basically just need an active network port for it to talk to itself. It did? Alright, well, I think I'm going to be doing this straight from slides at this point because I still can't get mine to stay stable. What's that? Actually, that's a... Alright. There goes my mic. Alright, let's see if I can play catch up real quick. You can do it! Yes. Who's ready for the lightning round? Alright, let's see how fast I can do this, and if I screw up, you guys can all point fingers and laugh. Yes. Yay, we got somewhere. Yep, get info, share folder, enable, session sharing permissions. Where'd we go? DeployStudio, select. Reading that. They're gonna think I'm like fast forwarding the video, but it's really just me going. Oh, that's not what I want. No, come on. Ah!
It's okay. It's okay.
All right, we're gonna try one more thing. We're gonna see if it's just what I downloaded. So we are going to go to DeployStudio.com. We are going to download again. Yes, there's going to be. Note to self, blooper reel. Yeah, I tried that 5 times on mine. Oh. I got 45. Is there any questions while I'm waiting for this to download? No? Yes, sure. Sure, so what it is during the initial configuration of DeployStudio, it's recommended to enable SSL, and in that process, the default non-SSL port is 60,080. As soon as you enable SSL, you need to start using port 60,443. So after the first time through the DeployStudio Assistant configuration, you'll need to, if you run the configuration again, or if you open up DeployStudio Admin afterwards, you'll need to start using port 60,443. So, if you choose to not use SSL, it'll remain 60,080. Does that clarify it? Okay. What's that? Correct. If you leave it 60,080, it sends passwords clear text, so don't do that. Start successful?
Good.
Okay, well, I think we're doing good. We're doing better. You can use localhost to connect to the service, but you can't use localhost to define AFP share. Oh, this says it's actually configured, so it managed to configure it. I'm good. All right, so continuing with the presentation, I am sorry for anyone else that's having troubles. Obviously, this is not just you. The primary preferred method of using DeployStudio is using Netboot Sets. And that is so, again, my background is computer lab, so I do this on a mass deployment scale. So creating little thumb drives for me is not exactly optimal. So we do this using Netboot Sets. So the next thing we're going to go through is actually creating a DeployStudio Netboot set. Now this is kind of another point that I want to make. Running DeployStudio on OS X server is preferred, and that's mainly because OS X server comes with a proper interface to do net install netboots, which I have a slide for that I can show you later. Yeah, because this doesn't have server on it. So the point is you're all on clients right now. Say at WWDC, they're like, here's a brand new MacBook Pro. Well, we'll say Mac Pro. Let's all kind of dream. Here's a brand new Mac Pro. Mac Pro comes with a reference build of 10.8.3 instead of 10.8.4. In order to boot that new Mac Pro into DeployStudio's NetBoot, you need to create the NetBoot set using the reference build. So that's where that comes in, is you want to learn how to create NetBoot sets on the clients you're actually going to be netbooting to. So that's kind of what we're going to simulate here. Has everyone got me on that? Any questions? Okay. So go ahead and say create a DeployStudio NetBoot set. First one's a bunch of information I never read and just skip. This is, again, in my environment, I have multiple computer labs with different versions. What? Okay. In my environment, I have multiple labs with different ages of hardware. Some still need to run 10.6 Snow Leopard simply because of the software that's used in those labs. And then I have others that are on 10.8.3. Sometimes there are issues with machines running 10.6.8 booting 10.8.3 netboot sets. So I have multiple netboot sets, effectively. So in order to distinguish between those netboot sets, I try and put as much information in the system name portion of this as possible. Yes? When they say latest hardware, it's mainly because the latest hardware will often come with a reference build. So for me, it's usually the latest OS build. Having said that, so for example, with the Mac Pro example again, Mac Pro will come with, say, 12D, some 4-digit number for the reference build. So you'll want the actual build number, correct. So what I often do is, again, in that case, and I'll show you that here. So I try and put as much information as possible in this here because it's actually what will show up as when you try and netboot, it's a string that'll show up. So I often will start with the server name. So we'll just call this DeployStudio because whatever. So server name. The next thing I'll do is the current version of DeployStudio that I'm on, and I'll show you why in the next step, but usually DeployStudio hates when your DeployStudio netboot set is a different version than the version the server is actually running. So I like to actually put the version of DeployStudio that the runtime was built on, or that the netboot was built on. The next piece of information is the combo version of the OS you're deploying, so 10.8.3. But as I just mentioned, there are reference builds of 10.8.3. So for example, this one is 12D78, which you can find by going to Apple About This Mac, and you can click on version once and it'll tell you the build number you're currently running. So I like to put that information in there. And the reason for that is again, with the Mac Pro example, if they come out with a reference build, it'll probably be something like this. So that way, what I like to do is there's often times where the reference build is a newer build than this build that we have on all the other Macs, but there's usually sometimes tweaks that don't work on older versions. So I tend to have a reference build netboot set, the latest 10.8.3 netboot set, and then the latest 10.6.8 netboot set. So I usually have 3 netboot sets all running off the same server, just for backwards compatibility and old hardware and stuff like that. So for now, I'm just going to make this what we're actually building it on, which is DeployStudio is the server name. We're running it on 1.6.0. The OS is 10.8.3, and the build number is 12D78. By default, you'll see the unique identifier is also 10.8.3. Again, if you do a reference build, you need that, it's a unique identifier, so it needs to be a different number. So I typically just add a 1 to the end of it. So if you're doing a reference build of 10.8.3, I make it 10.8.3.1. Because it needs to be unique. So you can't have, if you have a 10.8.3 regular build and then a 10.8.3 reference build, you need to have them different. Network time server, I typically set this to my actual time server on the network, but time.apple works just fine as long as the machine you're netbooting has internet access. All right, this part here, we're just going to kind of, I'm not going to talk about it too much, but the idea is you can have kind of a backup DeployStudio, so you can have your preferred and then you can have your backup effectively, your alternate. For us, we're just going to keep them the same. So again, this is going to be https:// whatever your IP address is, and then again you're going to start using port 60,443, and I usually just copy pasta that. And you'll notice there's a checkbox that says disable versions mismatch alerts. So previously, DeployStudio would complain if we just built a new netboot set on 1.6.0, but then 1.6.1 came out tomorrow. You'd have to again recreate that netboot set and bring it up to 1.6.1. Used to be the case. Luckily, they just released this new thing where you can ignore that as long as the communication protocol that they use to talk to the server from the netboot client doesn't change. And I've yet to see if they're going to let you know that changes, so you know you have to upgrade your netboot set. But in the meantime, you can check that box, and if 1.6.1 comes out tomorrow and you have 20 flash drives on 1.6.0, you can still continue to use those 20 flash drives, as long as 1.6.1 does not have a communication method change. So I'm going to check that, and we're going to hit continue. This part here is the default settings for what runtime when it boots up, and it also sets some other stuff for the environment. My recommendation, in my environment we use AD to authenticate into DeployStudio, so my recommendation is to keep all of this blank. The caveat to that is if you're doing a computer lab like me and you want to reimage 35 machines at once, you want to create a special netboot set, and I usually append the word auto to the end of it, that will automatically log in so that you can say automatically run this workflow, and so they log in automatically and run the workflow automatically. So you can image 35 machines hands off. I actually send a command through ARD to reboot to the netboot set, and then it's hands off after that. They just go through their workflow, and I have 35 machines freshly imaged. Unicast, it usually takes me about 10 minutes. I have a gigabit network with a gigabit uplink to the data center, so which is where my server is in the data center. So I usually can image a lab of 35 machines using multicast in about 10 minutes. And my base image is about 10 gigs. So just kind of give you an idea of what performance you can expect depending on your network. Mileage may vary. ARD user login and ARD VNC password. So if you have ARD, you can set this up so that you can control it, control the runtime environment from ARD. And this comes in handy because if you tell the computer in another building on the other side of town to boot into your netboot, there's no way to get it to un-netboot if it's just sitting at the login prompt. So this is kind of a nice way to be able to VNC or ARD into that runtime environment and say quit so that it'll boot back into the actual operating system. Or if it fails, sometimes it tends to just sit there. It depends on your workflows. But this gives you the opportunity to remotely tell it to, hey, stop that, reboot into the normal OS. So you can set that depending on if you use ARD. If you don't have ARD, you can still set a VNC password. And that comes in handy because in DeployStudio admin, it gives you the ability to use the built-in OS X screen sharing. Yes? Yeah, it doesn't actually create a user in the runtime, but it allows access using the username to the ARD service within the runtime, within the Netboot environment. So, no, but kind of to that note, like for example, before we started using AD to connect to our machines through ARD, we used to have a local account on all of our machines, and that's what we set up in ARD to connect to the machines. So kind of a pro tip, I guess, is if you use the same username and password that you use in the normal OS at this point here, then you don't have to change it in ARD. It'll show up in Netboot and it'll just show available. Or I think it shows up with screen sharing available or something like that. But otherwise, if you create a different username and password for the Netboot set and then have a different username for when it's actually in the OS, you have to change it in ARD each time. Otherwise, again, if you don't have ARD, you can set just a VNC password and use Apple's built-in screen sharing tool to connect to them as well. A couple other quick notes. DeployStudio used to have this awesome thing where the background was the log. They got rid of that and put it into its own window now for some reason. So I like to always display the log. It usually just shows up as a big blue window with, a log. Oh, sorry, Rusty's moving stuff over here on my screen. It's okay. Put display to sleep after 10 minutes. I often disable this simply because if I'm imaging a lab, I want to know that they're doing something. I don't want the displays to go to sleep because then I think it's just off and isn't doing the imaging process. So I usually disable that so that all my computers are facing the same way, so I can sit at the back of the lab and just kind of do a bird's eye view of what they're all doing. And if screens are off, I think the power is off, so I usually disable that. Reboot after 30 seconds automatically is kind of cool because, again, if you're trying to do this completely automated, you want the workflow to quit after 30 seconds, thus rebooting the computer and doing the finalized step after you image the machine. So I usually leave that at 30 seconds. You can obviously change that based on your preferences or disable it altogether. This part here is, again, more customization. If you have any scripts you want to run during your workflow that require Python or Ruby, you'll want to include those environments. Keynote here is if anyone's ever heard of Greg Nagel's Create OS 10 installer, it creates a package that allows you to install OS 10. That makes a package that uses Python scripts, so you need to include Python in your environment if you decide to use that as part of your workflow. I believe he actually talks about that in his blog, but I wanted to make sure that was out there because I forgot to do it for about 4 hours and couldn't figure out why it wasn't working.
How much what's the downside?
Great question. I've been meaning to actually figure out what the size difference is, and I just haven't done it, but to my understanding, it just includes the Python environment, so however big that... Usually, yeah. And again, I just haven't taken a look at the differences. So, and the same thing with Ruby is it's usually pretty small. Nowadays, I'm a little spoiled. I'm not going to lie. I have a Mac Mini with a solid state in it. Plus, I just got a whole computer lab plus a test Mac with Fusion drives. So for me, creating Netboot sets take like 3 minutes. So, phew, I could include everything and it wouldn't really faze me. So disable wireless support. Thing to note there is obviously if you're trying to image MacBook Airs over Wi-Fi, which I've had it work. Mileage will vary. It is kind of painful, so I'm going to try to advise you not to do it and keep wireless disabled. Disable ads. My recommendation here is at one point they actually broke their own ads. Basically, at one point it was calling home and they DOSed their own server effectively over in France. Yeah. I highly encourage that if you can, and this is freeware. It's freeware. It's not open source, but I highly encourage that if you have the ability to donate to these guys. It's actually one guy and a bunch of testers for the most part. But I like to disable the ads only because I don't like the vision of students seeing ads in my computer lab. I don't want them to get that connotation that we're going to start throwing ads at students. So that's why I disable it. So I just say disable ads and ignore the warning. Another thing to note here is you can put in a custom title if you want it to be all fancy. Like you could say that this is the RIT. Oops. You can say that this is the RIT runtime. You can make it all fancy if you want. Again, the other thing is this is actually the background. It doesn't really mention it anywhere. It's just kind of a picture. At least that's how I first saw it. But what you can do is you can take any background image you want, drag and drop it on top of that, and it'll change the background for you. So I'll just open up library desktop pictures real quick, and I'm just going to throw brushes on there. Bam. So you can put your school or company logo in there, anything you really want to kind of customize this a little bit more. Hit continue on that, and this is where the difference is between server and client. So if you're creating this Netboot set for a specific build on a client, you're going to want to, the default is desktop now, which is great. If you're on a server though, I don't know if I have a screenshot of that, but if you're on a server, it'll detect that you're running the Netboot service, and it'll actually ask you to dump the Netboot set directly into the Netboot folder. Library Netboot SP0. It'll dump it right in there for you. It also gives you two other options that says delete all other netboots that are already there, and then it'll also say set this as the default netboot set. So depending on what you're doing on your server, if you have multiple netboot sets, those can be used to manipulate which netboot set becomes your default. So for now, I'm not going to have you hit continue. As soon as you hit continue, it's going to prompt you for credentials, and it's going to start building your netboot set. So real quick, is there any questions? So if there's no questions for me to answer, I'm not going to waste the 5 to 10 minutes it usually takes to build the netboot set. But just know that when you do that, it's going to create a little icon in your desktop, and it's going to be a .nbi extension. It's actually just a folder. When that's done, all you would do at that point is take that NBI and upload it to your server. And typically what I do is I actually share my netboot folder as an AFP share on my server, and I just AFP into it and drag and drop my NBI, my netboot set. Everyone clear on that? Yes. It's creating a netboot set based on system files on the client that you're on. So that's why you want to make sure that if you have a reference build, you want to build it on the reference build, because it pulls drivers and stuff like that. So yes, we're going to skip that step. So go ahead and hit home.
So you don't want to build it on your server?
You can build it on your server as long as your server is the same OS version that you're running on your clients. Side note to that, actually, great, thank you for bringing that up. With 1.6.0, starting with 1.6.0, if you're running a Mountain Lion client or server, you must have a recovery partition available in order for it to create the netboot set. It's actually quite annoying because my server doesn't have a recovery partition, so I have to build mine on my clients at this point and then upload it to the server. So just keep that in mind. If you're running Mountain Lion's server and you don't have a recovery partition, you won't be able to create netboot sets on it. Yes, it won't even let you. I don't know at which point, but I tried it, and at one point it's like, I can't detect a recovery partition, so I'm not going to create a netboot set. Yes, and we'll kind of cover that here. I'm not going to go too in depth into actually imaging with DeployStudio in this session, but the thing to note is if you pull a master from a machine and it has a recovery partition, DeployStudio is smart enough to find that and pull the recovery partition as well. So, and then when you restore it, it'll also yes, that's actually the key. To me, it's the number one thing DeployStudio is used for, is pulling and deploying images. To me, the fact that it can do configurations and stuff like that is the bonus. So. No, it's a standard format. It creates a NetRestore image, I believe. Can you correct? What? Yes. Right. But it uses the same format if you were using NetRestore, I do believe. It uses the same tools as NetRestore to create the image, and ASR to deploy it and stuff like that. Yes. Yes, and kind of a good point with that is I actually use a utility called InstantImage to build my base image, and at the completion of the build, I actually have a script that just pushes it into the masters folder. But because they all use the same Apple tools, it all uses the same format, so they all are interchangeable. Okay? Hold on to that thought. Another question. Currently, the way I do I use InstantImage to create my base image. I don't pull a master using DeployStudio, and using InstantImage, I don't get a recovery partition right now. So the answer is I do not use a recovery partition in the labs right now. It's something this summer is something I'm going to be exploring if I need it. I know Apple wants it there, so I might just start putting it there anyways, but for now I don't use it. Yeah, there are some security flaws to having the recovery drive available, but that goes along with actually setting a firmware password so they can't boot into it and things like that. Any other? Oh, go ahead. So creating the Netboot set doesn't have anything to do with actually imaging or the recovery partition. If you use, when you create a workflow to pull a master, if the machine you're pulling the master from has a recovery partition, DeployStudio will recognize that, and it actually pulls two master images. It'll pull your base volume, but then it also pulls the recovery drive as a separate image as well. And then if you tell it to push that back down, it'll push both. It'll push the recovery and the master volume. So, but that's at the actual, pull a master and re-image step, not the Netboot step. Yep. The four base workflows that come with DeployStudio, yes. Effectively what Netboot does is it allows you to boot off the network to memory, thus freeing up any locks on the hard drive. So the hard drive isn't being touched at all. And then that's what allows you to image to the hard drive. And what all the Netboot set, I won't say all the Netboot set does, but what it runs is the DeployStudio runtime. And that runtime is the window that gives you the list of available workflows. And then the runtime is what actually runs the workflow tasks. Okay? Questions so far? We're good? Back to why do I use InstantImage? Another one of those fundamental monolithic versus modular imaging things. I'm not going to go too in-depth with it here, but I will tell you I use InstantImage to inject iWork, iLife, and Office because we have site licenses for those. We have AELP and Microsoft Volume License Program, VLP or something like that. So what I do is I take the base image, inject those three rather large installs, and dump them all into the base image. And then that way, when I do a multicast restore or even just a unicast restore, it's a block level restore of those files as opposed to installing them to the OS afterwards. So just to let everyone know, my exact setup is InstantImage, base image that comes with Office, iWork, and iLife. And then after that gets deployed out using DeployStudio, I run some other configuration scripts. I bind it to AD using DeployStudio. I bind it to OD using DeployStudio. And then my very last step is installing Monkey and configuring Monkey. And then all the rest of my software gets pulled down from my Monkey repo. And that's how I choose to do my modular deployment. So I can go in, that's a whole nother session about modular versus monolithic, but that's kind of it in a nutshell for me. Any questions? Okay, I've got 11 minutes left. So with that, let me go back to my slides real quick and see if I'm forgetting anything. I'm sorry, I'm just looking. Just want to make sure I didn't forget anything. Actually, I have one thing I do want to show you, if I can get there. So, sure. This is the server interface for those of you that aren't familiar with it. Unfortunately, I only grabbed a screenshot with only one netboot in there, but this is where you will see multiple netboots if you have multiple netboots. The one thing I just want to point out is the little green dot, obviously, meaning that it's available through the netboot service, but also the default in parentheses over there. Default in parentheses is important for older hardware. And forgive me for not being awesome with my hardware like some people, but there are, when you boot a Mac, there's the option to, or you can hold the option key to select the volume you boot from. Newer Macs, it'll actually use BSDP protocol to detect all the netboot sets that are available, and it'll sit there and it'll list all of them. If you're on an older Mac, it won't even show a netboot at all. At least in my environment, it doesn't show netboot at all. You actually have to hold the option key, it'll show you Macintosh HD, and then you press the N key, and it'll start looking for a netboot set. But it'll only show you one, and that one is going to be your default. So in my environment, because it's predominantly newer machines that run 10.8.3, my default is my 10.8.3 Netboot set. If you're in an environment that also has 10.6.8 clients, then ironically, the 10.6.8 clients are typically the ones that don't have the ability to show multiple Netboot sets. They're the older hardware. So sometimes I'll actually just come in, and if I know I'm imaging that lab, I'll just temporarily change the default to the 10.6.8 Netboot set. Okay? More advanced stuff that I'm not going to go into in either session, but you can actually get really tricky, and when a client tries to netboot, it actually sends its model identifier to the server, to the netboot server. So you can actually get really advanced and say, this netboot set is available for these models, and then this netboot set is available for these models, so that when the default actually becomes whatever's available to that model identifier. So that should be out on the web. I just started getting into blogging a little bit on WordPress, which I have that address later. So hopefully at some point I'll actually go into that. So if you guys ever have a mixed hardware environment, that could be useful to you guys. So I just wanted to show that. Someone had a question, I heard. Yes.
So you install DeployStudio on Replica.
Mm-hmm.
You have to install it again on the server?
Yes. The simple answer is yes. You install DeployStudio on the server that's going to house all your images and your packages and your configurations. Correct. No, actually I take that back. So the question was, you have to do the setup twice. And no, you have to do the complete configuration once on your server, but then when you need to build a Netboot set, you don't actually have to configure the server on your client. You can just install it, and then all you're trying to get to is the to run the assistant. So that's all you need on your client when you're building a reference build or any build, a Netboot set. You only need to install server but not configure it on the client, and then you just need to open Assistant to create the DeployStudio Netboot set. Good question. Okay, so Netboot is over. Now we're on to actual DeployStudio admin. And I'm going to go into the different things that are available there, which I can't do there. So go ahead and quit out of DeployStudio Assistant. No, you are not building the Netboot image, because I don't know how long it'll take on these maps. Okay, so what you want to do is Applications, Utilities again, and you should see DeployStudio Admin. Great brand new Retina logo. You open that up, and you'll get your server address. Now, this again is one of the locations that you can use your localhost address if it is your localhost. So go ahead and do HTTPS 127 or localhost 60443. Correct. This is at this point you should be running this on your server, your actual server, not your client that you're building the Netboot on. So DeployStudio and your password. Down to 6 minutes. So we're gonna zip through this. So I apologize if. Oh boy. What's that? Weren't we talking about potato guns the other day? Okay, well, that's obviously not going to work for me either today. So we're going to go just to slides. So if you guys can open DeployStudio Admin, you can sort of follow along. But so activity is the first section. This is actually really hard to do without an example. So activity basically shows any computers that are currently running the DeployStudio runtime. And what I'll note about that is if you look in the top left of DeployStudio Admin, hold on, it's doing something. I might get in. Yeah, that's what I got, was unknown host. You can try the IP. If you get unknown host, you can try the actual IP address, but usually localhost works just fine. Okay, so I'm just going to ignore that. So activity will show anything that's running the runtime. Now the runtime is what you run inside the Netboot environment, as I mentioned before, but you can actually install the runtime on your clients, and you can start using DeployStudio as a self-service option as well. Again, that's some advanced stuff, but I just want you to know that it's there. Also, if you look in the top left of DeployStudio Admin, you'll see there's a nice little thing, icon that says runtime. you can run your runtime at the same time that you're running your admin to kind of test your workflows, your non-imaging workflows on your machine right there. Again, this is something I recommend you do on a test machine, not your actual server. So runtime, if it's running, shows up in activity. Shows you information like host name, IP address, but also in activity is where you get the ability to say control, and that's where if you had enabled VNC in the Netboot environment, you'd be able to control the machine through that interface. Any questions on that? No? Another note on that actually is if it's actually currently running a workflow, it gives you like a little box for each task that's in your workflow with like a status of which workflow it's on and if the workflow is successful or not, and it just kind of keeps going. Yeah. Computers, this is where the database of computers comes in. And I'm sorry that I can't show you this, but there is the option to add a computer manually. There's a little plus sign you'll notice at the bottom of the interface at this point. So you can manually edit computers or manually add computers. There are some key pieces there. God, I really wish I could show you this. Yes, that's actually a great thing, a great point as well. He asked if you could import a list. If you go back to the DMG you mounted, there's an extras folder in there. In that extras folder, there's actually an example CSV file, and you can use that example CSV file to mass import computers into DeployStudio. So it's got the proper headings and information that you need. And if I recall correctly, you don't need each header, you don't need each piece of information. I believe all you need is whatever unique identifier you configure DeployStudio with. So in this case, it would be your serial number. Then you can put in host name and some other information. The one thing I did want to show here that unfortunately I can't is if you look, there's 6 tabs I want to say. You should be able to see it, but the last one is automation. And in that automation tab, you should be able to say select default workflow or something to that nature. And that is how you would effectively completely automate the imaging of a computer lab. You would say, it starts off with creating a Netboot workflow or a Netboot set that automatically logs in. And when it logs in, if that computer object in the database says automatically run this workflow, it'll start running that workflow. So that's what I do is I create a Netboot set, it logs in, pulls that I want it to run my reimage workflow, and then it's off and away. And then because again you said quit this runtime after 30 seconds, the computer quits, restarts, finishes its imaging process, and an hour later after Monkey does its thing, your computer is imaged and ready to go for your user to use. So you can completely automate all of DeployStudio from start to finish. It's just a matter of how you set it up. That's a great point. I knew that was available, but I've never actually used it. So you can export, if you have ARD, you can export your computers from there and import into DeployStudio. Will DeployStudio do an auto discovery? No. The closest thing you get is if you did not check reject computers, you can netboot the computer and it'll check into the server and add itself to the database, but the reject computers has to be disabled. Does that make sense? Okay. Sometimes I say it one way and I don't know if everyone understands. So, any other questions at this point? I got 30 seconds. Yep.
Software that you have an app store that you don't have that,
I'm going to say out of scope for this, but basically I don't install anything from the App Store. All the stuff I install comes from a website, and I use Monkey to install my packages. Talk to me after. One of the things to note is if I like to do an out-of-box experience workflow, and the iLife that comes installed by default from Apple has a Max App Store receipt. You have to delete that receipt in order to use your own iLife installation. That gets tricky. You can talk to me later if you want. So I will kind of blow through this real quick. There are 23 workflow tasks, the latest one being the Fusion task. I just got the brand new iMacs with the Fusion drives. The Fusion task works wonderfully. It's really nice. I'll just say that. Masters, if you pull an image, this is where the master will show up. Additionally, if you pull a master using another tool, say InstaDMG, there's a plus button, you can import masters from other locations, and they all show up in that list. Packages, again, you can use DeployStudio to install just basic packages if you choose not to use Monkey or any other software deployment tool. Yep. You have to have something that'll allow you to run the runtime to pull an image. So it's either a Netboot set or you can create a flash drive or some kind of external drive. So yes. So packages, it's pretty self-explanatory. It allows you to add packages to a workflow. And scripts is the same way. You can create scripts that'll allow you to configure machines and you just add it into the workflow. The thing to note about scripts, there's two options. You can either run a script in the Netboot set or you can postpone it to run after the OS has been installed and run at the OS level instead of at the Netboot level. So important note there. Apparently my transition stopped. I think that's it. All right, yeah. So that's that. Thank you.